Prairie Dog Management, a presentation for American Military University, course EVSP 330, Fish and Wildlife Policies, Programs, and Issues. Presented by Dustin Kane. Fish and Wildlife presents society with controversial issues as various groups have separate interests and goals. These ideals and goals can often conflict each other, especially when it comes to management of a species. This presentation will discuss the prairie dog, primarily the black-tailed prairie dog, and the current management conflict it faces. To understand the issue, the presentation will discuss an overview of the species itself, the habitat of the prairie dog, why the prairie dog classifies as a keystone species. It will present the case for removal, as well as the stance for conservation, current management of the species, how invasive species have affected the prairie dog, adaptive management techniques, and ways forward. There are 5 species labeled prairie dog, all of which are identified as ground squirrels. The black-tailed prairie dog, Cynomys luteficanus, is a member of the Scudidae family, like squirrels. It has an average length of 35 to 41 centimeters, with a weight ranging from 705 to 1,675 grams. The male is typically larger in both. There is a common misconception that, like other rodents, the prairie dog breeds frequently and produces many offspring. However, it has been found that the female prairie dog is only sexually receptive one day of the year, giving birth to 1 to 8 young. Of that, there is an average emergence of 3 from the burrow, as high infant mortality rates and cannibalism threatens the young. After emergence, young males will disperse to new colonies to reduce interbreeding. The diet of the prairie dog is herbivorous, foraging mostly on native plants. However, it is not uncommon for insects or other prairie dogs to end up on the menu. Due to this diet, they do not require a constant water source, as their metabolic needs are met through ingestion. The habitat of the prairie dog is open grasslands, with a range of northern Mexico to the southern border of Canada. Once estimated to cover nearly 79 million acres in the early 1900s, it is now estimated they only inhabit roughly 2.4 million acres, a 97% decrease. This decrease has been due to eradication by humans during expansion and land control for livestock grazing, as well as the introduction of the plague. Habitats consist of colonies and towns, a grouping of colonies. While it is estimated that Texas once held a 125-mile prairie dog town, it was found in a 1996 study in Montana that the average of 1,334 colony sizes only reached 49 acres. While vast open areas may seem desolate, they are teeming with other life. There has been much debate over how important the prairie dog is to the ecosystem. According to National Geographic, a keystone species is an organism that helps define an entire ecosystem. Without its keystone species, the ecosystem would be dramatically different or cease to exist altogether. When studying the prairie dog, it is easy to see that they fit this description. The foraging method of clipping promotes plant health and reduces risk of overgrowth. The scratching and digging and defecating in the soil aerates and introduces important nitrogen for new plant life to grow. It is not only plants that rely on this species, as their burrows become home to opportunists such as snakes, foxes, and the burrowing owl, and the endangered black-footed ferret. The impact does not stop there. Predators such as coyotes, birds, snakes, and the black-footed ferret all feed on the prairie dog. The species is so vital to the black-footed ferret that the decline of the prairie dog population, along with a contracted plague, drove the ferret into endangered status. It has been found that areas that have prairie dogs contain more biodiversity and healthier plant life. Despite these findings, there is a rooted belief in the ranching, farming, and rural community that the prairie dog is a pest that must be removed. The primary advocate for prairie dog removal is the rancher and farmer. With a herbivorous diet, a colony can quickly decimate a sprouting crop field, causing heavy financial losses. In free-range livestock operations, prairie dogs are seen as competition, reducing available resources for grazing. A USDA study found that the removal of the prairie dog would increase grazing resources for livestock from 4 to 7%, identifying that there is not enough reward after resources spent, and as stated previously, the loss of biodiversity. Other concerns include burros being a threat to broken legs of cattle or horses. When looking at the larger inhabitants of grasslands, such as antelope, deer, and bison, it can be seen that the larger animals adapt well to the prairie dog presence. Furthermore, there have been very few reported cases of injury due to prairie dog burrows. The final common reason for prairie dog disdain amongst ranchers is the presence of predators. Coyotes are responsible for heavy livestock losses, and foxes and skunks can carry the risk of rabies. While ranchers are not alone in advocating removal of the species, hunters and sport shooting enthusiasts find the species a tempting target, and while generally more understanding of biodiversity, generally do not find the species a necessity to federally protect or reintroduce to areas that are absent of the prairie dog population. The final call for removal is for the risk of disease, specifically the plague. Mountain Home Air Force Base in Idaho has spent thousands of dollars in renovation of the military working dog training facility to reduce the risk of this zoonotic threat spreading to the dogs. Likewise, people hear about a person contracting the disease and fear the presence of the prairie dog will cause these numbers to increase. While some call for the removal of the species, others call for conservation for several reasons. The first being, most people who do not directly have contact, such as those in urban settings, generally have a higher opinion of protecting the species, according to John Hoagland's Conservation of the Black-tailed Prairie Dog. Other claims for conservation are the fact that the species does meet the keystone species definition and removing it removes biodiversity. Not surprisingly, anyone interested in or actively participating in the reintroduction and management of the black-footed ferret is absolutely in favor of the prairie dog conservation and reintroduction, as the species depends almost exclusively on the prairie dog. Other environmentalists and biologists favor the species conservation and are actively seeking to educate about the misconception others may have. Finally, there are those who have a biocentric or ecocentric view that promotes protecting species outside of human interests.
There's plenty of reason to be depressed, but there's also plenty of reason for hope. Look what I'm taking care of here, and I'm doing it on a lot of different properties. I had already made the decision to bring back all the species that we possibly could, or encourage them, and then I ran across prairie dogs just popped up, and they were obviously a little bit of research told me they were in trouble. Prairie dogs are a keystone species. They're really important. If you don't have prairie dogs, you don't have black-footed ferrets, you don't have burrowing owls, you don't have some of the upland birds. So it wasn't just the prairie dog. They have little social groups very similar to human settlements, and they're just as cute as they can be. We've made a lot of progress. We're just going to have to keep at it and pray to God that we get enough people convinced to change over to a sustainable way of living before it's too late. We're here to be.
Although removal efforts are still in effect, so are conservation actions. The National Park Service had stated the prairie dog should be conserved and recovered wherever possible. Efforts to do just that are underway. However, it is not as easy as some may think. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service stated in 2011 that the black-tailed prairie dog does not meet conditions to be listed as threatened or endangered under the Endangered Species Act. However, the Utah prairie dog does and is listed as threatened. This has caused concern as this particular species is only found in the state of Utah. People of the state, generally those calling for the removal of the species, believes the decision to manage a species specific to one location should be handled by the state and not through federal oversight. This goes back to the federal listing of animals on grazing lands, creating problems for the rancher. Because the Endangered Species Act is federal, The species listed are protected federally, and the states must follow federal guidelines. However, when it comes to the black-tailed prairie dog, the non-listing at neither the state or federal level has stopped some individuals or states to take action. A large ranch operation near Roundup, Montana, known as Twin Butte Ranch, has dedicated time, money, and even endured ridicule for the practice of prairie dog conservation. The Trennells, who own the ranch, do not believe in removing the animal, but rather coexisting. They believe that working with the ecosystem is more profitable than working against, wasting time and resources to remove wildlife. The Trennells do intervene with digging dens for foxes and installing bird posts, but they do not poison or shoot any of the wildlife on the land. They think of it as a natural zoo. The profits the Trennells have seen have allowed them to partner with the Natural Conservancy to purchase 60,000-acre Matador Ranch, which will serve as both a ranching operation and prairie dog refuge. Many people in the area ridicule this idea, and Trennell agrees that the size of operation matters. If you have several thousand acres, a prairie dog town won't make much of a difference to your operation, but if you only have a few hundred acres, you'll see the impact they can make. Twin Butte Ranch is not alone in their efforts. The state of Montana itself has identified the black-tailed prairie dog as a species that, while not listed as threatened or endangered, is in need of a management plan. Thus, in 2002, the Montana Prairie Dog Working Group completed the plan with set objectives, practices, and alternative measures. The plan illustrates that in 1907, the prairie dog inhabited nearly 1.5 million acres in Montana. By a 2001 study, this number dropped to a mere 90,000 acres, with 40,000 lost in the previous 2 decades. The plan outlines 5 objectives with several methods to achieve said objective. The objectives are: confer legal status on prairie dogs that is consistent with policy provisions of Section 85.5, 102, and 103 MCA and our current management needs. Develop statewide and regional prairie dog distribution and abundance standards. Develop management protocol for prairie dog conservation on federal, state, and private lands. Develop and implement a prairie dog ecosystem education program. Identify and support or conduct research projects designed to form solutions to short-term and long-term biological and social problems related to black-tailed prairie dog communities and their management. Through identification of need and implementation of plans such as this one, states can take the right steps towards prairie dog conservation and proper management. The need for conservation is not derived only from direct human interaction. The introduction of non-native and invasive species can in itself call for action. Invasive species are those who, not native to the ecosystem, change it, impacting the native species negatively. The native species often do not have methods to compete with or defeat the new species. Such is the case with the prairie dog and Yersinia pestis, the bacteria responsible for the sylvatic and bubonic plague. While many people believe the prairie dog is the carrier of the plague, it is actually several species of fleas that carry the bacteria. These fleas were introduced in the 1900s and have had devastating tolls in the prairie dog population. Having no natural defense against the bacterium, the sylvatic plague is often spread quickly within a colony and to other susceptible mammals, making it a zoonotic and a human health concern. This disease has a high mortality rate for the prairie dog, over 90% in most cases, with the infected dying in just 3 to 4 days. Interventions to combat the bacteria and disease must be taken to achieve proper conservation and management of the prairie dog population and the ecosystem as a whole. Management of a species cannot be based on just one action or another. To be successful, it takes the use of scientific study and public input. The combination of efforts leads to successful adaptive management practices. In the case of the prairie dog, scientific measures to combat fleas has continued to develop over the years. The initial practice was to use insecticides that killed the fleas. This turned out to be ineffective as it was costly, time-consuming, and challenging to reach all necessary areas. Furthermore, it was found that after years of use, fleas were becoming resistant to the powder and spray, and non-targeted species were becoming affected. In 2016, several areas were selected for trials for vaccination. Drones were used to drop sugar cube-sized, peanut butter-flavored pellets that contained the vaccine. Initial trials were successful. Areas saw lower decline in prairie dogs due to the plague, and the introduced black-footed ferret sustained healthy numbers. Management teams will further the vaccination process through the use of delivery methods, such as all-terrain vehicles and walking patrols. Through these methods, it is believed more areas can be covered in a shorter period of time. The public is relied on to give information on areas that may contain new or unknown colonies so the land can be potentially protected or studied. The Devil's Tower Monument area has successfully created a plan that includes passive, active, and adaptive management practices. The section listed as adaptive management states that this approach is a combination of passive and active methods. The methods include passive relocation, allowing the prairie dogs to exit the burrow but not re-enter, encouraging movement to a new area, active relocation through trapping, testing, and releasing, installation of barriers to prevent access to undesired areas or contain an already inhabited location, and, as a last resort, lethal control when necessary. This combination of methods is believed to have higher success rate of desired management over using just passive or active measures. The prairie dog, regardless of subspecies, is a key player in the ecosystem, hence its titling as a keystone species. Their existence, or absence, directly affects a grassland ecosystem. To have an optimal, natural ecosystem, their presence is required. It is also necessary to create and maintain a healthy population to ensure the success and reintroduction of the black-footed ferret. To achieve this requires 4 key elements. The first is education. If people do not understand the issue, they are far less likely to get involved, and outdated, incorrect information will keep the idea of necessary eradication alive in the rural ranching communities. The second is relocation and protection efforts. When relocating prairie dogs, it has been found translocation of the family had much higher success rates than individual relocation. When it comes to protection, the Twin Butte Ranch can be considered revolutionary in their idea of protecting the lands as is while operating a livestock business. Partnerships such as this one should be rewarded and fostered across the nation. However, this will not happen overnight, so government, rather that be local, tribal, state, or federal, is needed to protect areas of known prairie dog populations. The third key measure is the continuation of vaccination. The more vaccinations and studies that can be conducted to prevent loss through sylviatic plague, the better. While there is a concern of mutation and adaptation from the bacteria, constant monitoring will help combat this. The use of volunteers to spread the vaccine can drastically cut financial strain on federal and state departments. The final method to establish conservation and management would be financial incentives. This directly ties with Measure 2. If ranchers are afraid of lost income due to prairie dogs, the money spent to remove the species could be spent as incentives to keep them and protect them on the land they inhabit. This makes up for lost profit and maintains a healthy, natural ecosystem. This concludes the Prairie Dog Management presentation for American Military University, course EVSP 330, Fish and Wildlife Policies, Programs, and Issues. Reference material can be found on the following slides.